Sometime around the 21st century BC, in a city called Lagash, somebody sharpened a copper blade and changed the next 3,000 years of human politics. The eunuch was about to become the most powerful person in 11 civilizations, and you, friend, are next in line. From Sumer to Constantinople, from the harems of Persepolis to the Forbidden City, the same job description shows up over and over again. Trusted with the kingdom, forbidden from leaving offspring, quietly running everything while the king takes the credit. Today you find out exactly how the worst day of your life turned into the steadiest career in the ancient world. Lagash, 21st century BC. Welcome to history. The bureaucrats of ancient Sumer kept very detailed records. Cuneiform tablets from the city of Lagash mentioned something nobody had bothered to write down before, a category of palace official called the Gursaku. And to be a Gursaku you had to be missing a couple of important pieces. This is the earliest written evidence of the institution of the eunuch on earth, and it shows up not at the edges of society but at the absolute top of it. The court of Lagash, where the king ate his bread, was already running on staff who could not, biologically speaking, plot to put their kids on the throne. Why? Because dynasties are messy. If your most powerful advisor has children, those children grow up, those children get land, those children's grandchildren become a rival dynasty, and 3 generations from now, your great-grandkids are getting stabbed in a temple by some smug noble whose great-grandpa once signed your tax forms. Eunuchs solve that problem permanently. Their loyalty has nowhere else to go. The Sumerians figured this out before they figured out paper. Your Sumerian career path: temple servant, royal chamberlain, possibly a manager of the wool industry, which was a much bigger deal than it sounds. You wear linen, you eat bread and beer, you live longer than nearly everyone outside the palace, because you eat better, and when the kings of Akkad start showing up to flatten the place around 2334 BC, you do what eunuchs always do. You simply work for the new boss. The job outlasts the empire. It will keep outlasting empires for the next 3,000 years. Egypt wants your brain, not your beard. Move forward a millennium. You are now in the Egyptian court, somewhere between the Old Kingdom paperwork piles and a Ptolemaic poisoning. The Egyptians had a quirk that scholars still argue about. Their version of the eunuch was sometimes very literally castrated, and sometimes the word just meant high-ranking guy whose loyalty is so absolute we treat him as if. Egyptian texts use a single sign, sometimes translated as eunuch, sometimes as official, and there is real archaeological back and forth on whether figures like Potiphar in the Joseph story were physically eunuchs or just bureaucrats who never made it into the gossip column. The skeletal evidence has only recently caught up. In 2017, researchers re-examined Ptolemaic period bones from the Quesna necropolis and found a small group of male skeletons with hormone-related bone development consistent with pre-puberty castration. Translation: there were real, identifiable surgical eunuchs in Egypt, and they were buried with the dignity of priests. So this was never a fringe thing. Your Egyptian job is not the harem job. That comes later, in other empires. Here you are, an administrator. You manage the granary, you count cattle, you read foreign letters from the Hittite court because you, unlike most of the nobility, have the patience to learn cuneiform without complaining. By the time Cleopatra is on the throne, the senior eunuch in the palace, a man named Pothinus, is running the actual government of Egypt, while teenage Ptolemy XIII is busy losing a civil war. Pothinus is the one who decides Pompey the Great should be murdered on a beach in 48 BC. You, in this scenario, are filing the paperwork for that decision. Welcome to imperial-level decision-making, with no possibility of personally inheriting any of it. Assyria builds the operating system. By the early 9th century BC, an Assyrian king called Ashur-nisirpal II takes the loose Sumerian and Egyptian model and turns it into a proper institution. The word in Akkadian is Shah Reshi, literally, one of the head, because the eunuch shaved his face and you could spot him a mile off in court reliefs. He is the only beardless guy in a palace full of beards. There are reliefs in the British Museum, where you can play Spot the Eunuch, and win every single time. Under Ashur-nisirpal and his successors, the Rab Shah Reshi, the chief eunuch, becomes one of the 7 highest-ranking officers in the empire. He sits next to the treasurer, the cupbearer, the chief judge, the grand vizier, the palace herald, and the commander-in-chief. Half of those positions are themselves often filled by eunuchs. Some of these guys, like Shah Nabushu, raise their own armies and lead campaigns. Reliefs at Nimrud show eunuch officers receiving foreign kings at the gate, taking tribute, and standing one step behind the king at every public ritual. There is a moment, in 626 BC, that should not be possible. A eunuch named Sin Shumulashir actually claims the Assyrian throne for himself during a succession crisis. He doesn't last long. The empire is collapsing anyway. But the man who could not have children technically becomes king of Assyria. The system was working so well, it almost replaced the people it was supposed to serve. What's in it for you? The Neo-Assyrian eunuch is essentially a senior civil servant with no exit options. You will be promoted on merit because nobody in the palace cares who your father was, and frankly your father gave you up. You will eat off bronze, you will travel. You will probably not die in battle, because senior officials rarely do. You will, however, almost certainly die in a palace coup, because the late Assyrian court runs on backstabbing the way our age runs on quarterly reports. Persia, where the eunuch becomes the kingmaker. The Persians inherit the Assyrian system after Cyrus the Great rolls into Babylon in 539 BC, and they do what Persians always do, which is take a working idea and make it bigger, gaudier, and more dangerous. The Achaemenid court has a small army of eunuchs, organized into specific titles, with control over access to the great king himself. Greek historians like Ctesias write about this with their hair on fire, partly because they find it shocking, and partly because it makes great copy back home in Athens. Enter the most famous eunuch in Persian history, a man named Bagoas. There were actually 2 Bagoases, and you really do need to know the difference. The first Bagoas, around 340 BC, was the chief minister of Artaxerxes III, and he took court politics about as far as it could possibly go. He poisoned Artaxerxes III. He installed Artaxerxes IV. He poisoned Artaxerxes IV. He installed Darius III, who was supposed to be his puppet. Darius III, having watched 2 emperors die in a row, did not feel like being the third. So when Bagoas tried to poison him too, Darius forced him to drink his own cup. Diodorus Siculus describes this with obvious satisfaction. The man who killed 2 kings of Persia died gargling on his own poison. The second Bagoas, a generation later, was a young court eunuch favored by Darius III, and then, when Alexander the Great rolled in, and Darius died, by Alexander himself. He was reportedly very, very handsome. He won a dance contest at Alexander's victory festival in Carmania. He lived a much quieter life than his namesake, which in Persian court terms means he died in bed. If you are a Persian court eunuch, your day involves these things: managing access to the king, supervising the women's quarters, escorting foreign ambassadors, possibly getting taught a second or third language so you can negotiate with Egyptians or Greeks, and watching everybody else die before you do. Your salary is paid in silver. Your political ceiling is essentially unlimited. Your life expectancy depends entirely on whether you know how to back the right faction. The Greeks sneer, then hire you anyway. Here is something the Greeks would never admit out loud. They thought eunuchs were a degenerate Eastern habit, an insult to manhood, a sign of barbarian decadence, and they wrote about it in tones of pure horror in basically every classical text from Herodotus onwards. Then the Hellenistic period happens. Alexander dies, his generals carve up the Mediterranean, and almost every single one of those new Greek kingdoms quietly adopts the Persian court system, eunuchs and all. So much for principles. Your life as a Hellenistic eunuch can look surprisingly successful. Take Hermias of Atarneus. He was a slave who rose to rule a small kingdom in northwestern Anatolia in the 4th century BC. Ancient sources call him a eunuch, although modern scholars suspect that may have been a slur from his political enemies. Either way, he ran his own city. He was a former student at Plato's academy, and he was Aristotle's patron and father-in-law. Aristotle lived in his court, married his niece Pythias, and wrote a hymn for him after the Persians captured and crucified him in 341 BC. So if your retirement plan involves have Aristotle write you a hymn, you could do worse. Then there is Philotaris of Pergamon, and his story is one of the strangest in this whole tour. According to his successor Attalus I, baby Philotaris was carried into a crowd, got pressed against people, and had his testicles crushed by accident. He grew up to become the keeper of the treasury at Pergamon for the general Lysimachus. When Lysimachus's family imploded around 282 BC, Philotaris quietly switched sides, kept the treasury for himself, and used it to bankroll an entire new kingdom. He never married. He had no biological heirs. He passed the throne to his nephew, who passed it to his nephew, and so on. And the dynasty that began with a baby's accident in a Greek crowd ruled Pergamon for 150 years and built one of the great libraries of the ancient world.